Folks, I love Gundam. Generally speaking, I love Gundam when it's good, and I love it when it's bad. I even give G Savior a pass because it clearly had some ideas and only wanted for the budget to fully execute them. That being said, Gundam Narrative is proof positive that if there was a thread running through Universal Century Gundam shows, that thread has been lost at some point in the last decade. The main problem is that Gundam Narrative, like Gundam Unicorn before it, focused really heavily on new types, or at least it wants to. But new types alone do not make a Gundam series. You know, it's funny. I rag on Star Wars fans who don't like the Force and the Jedi stuff, and I always have to ask, is like the huge driving force in your story about space wizards with laser swords isn't interesting to you? But while there are interesting things in philosophizing that one can do about the nature of good and evil while talking about the light and dark side of the Force, new types don't really have that luxury. If anything, they're a millstone around the neck of Gundam writers who are working in the Universal Century time period. To explain, new types in the Gundam universe are people that have what can best be described as psychic powers, I guess, maybe, in that they can sense people, like with the Force, and this translates to faster reaction times and mild precognition. If anything, it works more like a spider sense than psychic powers, as one might put them in a different sci-fi setting. But since the UC wrote itself into a corner in the late 80s, people were really trying to reinforce the whole new type thing for mainline Gundam movies in the current era. This, and an unfortunate need to tie everything together, ends up making a real mess out of the writing of newer Gundam material, which is why a lot of the alternate universe stuff is so much easier to swallow. All this to say that Gundam Narrative is very flawed. It's unfocused, it's meandering, the action is understated and yet very extreme, but at least the mobile suits are drawn instead of rendered, for the most part. But let's get to the meat of the issue here. The story focuses around Michelle, Jonah, and Rita, three childhood friends who garnered a rep as new types because Rita had a premonition and they used it to warn people about the colony drop in 0079. So, cut to nearly 20 years later, Rita is missing, Jonah is a pilot, and Michelle is the adopted daughter of Luyo Woomin, who's sitting in a tank waiting to croak. Oh, by the way, there's a third Gundam unicorn out there called the Phoenix. Where'd it come from? Probably the same place Palpatine got all those Star Destroyers. Just roll with it. So Michelle and Jonah are hunting for the Phoenix because reasons that you probably guessed already if you have any media literacy at all. But just in case, they do hammer this home rather much for my taste. Upon finding said Phoenix, they try to engage it, but it's got unicorn powers that make it exist outside of space-time in good sense. So now the Zeon Special Forces are after it, as well as the Earth Federation, but they want to keep it hush-hush because we don't want to interfere with the timeline. Look, that was fine with Gundam 0083, but that well is mighty dry at this point. What's really giving me pause, though, is that I can barely remember anything that really happened in it. There was some shooting and some shouting and some uninspired mecha designs and then some very big explosions and a lot of characters I didn't have time to care about got killed. Not exactly what I'd call a great reflection on the movie, considering I literally finished watching it, had a walk, and then sat down to write this. Oof. It may just be that this was ill-conceived from the start, or that something tripped up while trying to write and produce this film, but half the characters are unnamed goons, the other are underdeveloped main characters, and then there are cameos from Zeta Gundam characters that most people in the West probably don't know. None of them are the ones you might care about either, so, don't get your hair in a bun. The movie is half-baked in the way that it's really hard to articulate. It definitely thinks it's got more punch than it does, and it's kind of relying on that to keep your attention. One of the big problems with this is that you could replace Jonah with a ham sandwich, and the story wouldn't really need all that much changing. Michelle should have probably been the main pilot, a rich girl who uses her influence to joyride around in a Gundam, looking for a friend she did dirty all those years ago. It'd be a much smoother story than this hiccup. Paired with all this is animation that looks gorgeous, and timeline appropriate if somewhat underwhelming mecha designs. I suppose the main issue with new types at this point, which will translate into the main issue with narrative here, is that I understand the Force, and for the most part, other writers understand the Force. It's well understood in precisely what it is. It's an energy field that surrounds us and penetrates us and binds the galaxy together. Newtypes in the Universal Century don't really have that. And frankly, if Tomino has anything to say about it, they probably shouldn't. Newtypes were conceived to be better pilots incidentally, not as superhumans with control over time and space, but they are now superhumans with control over time and space, and we all just have to kind of deal with it. Gundam Narrative features a number of scenes where people ask what the point of it all is, and if your characters are wondering that, then so is your audience. And if your audience is wondering that, buddy, you've got trouble. As it stands, the only thing that this particular narrative does is confuse. So the main problem with working in the Universal Century is that if you don't put it down the line a ways and have it connect up with stuff that's happened in the gap between Char's counterattack in UC 0093 and the stuff that happened in Gundam F91, which was UC 121, I think. I'm off the cuff for this one, so forgive me. The problem is that you can't really do anything world-changing, and you can't really hook it into the old stuff because the old stuff has kind of been solved. It's finished. Char's counterattack put a pin in the first arc of Gundam, so trying to go back to that area and of time and space is kind of fruitless. Where Gundam works the best in side stories like this is probably personal stories like the one that I described, which would be a better story for Gundam Narrative. Stories about mishaps and weird stuff that's gone on, training accidents, and maybe a little basic military sci-fi stuff. And I know that's probably not what Tomino would have wanted with his franchise, but that's where it is right now because it's out of his control. What would have made Gundam Narrative feel like a satisfying narrative? I honestly don't know. I think that it was probably ill-conceived from the start. I think that the designs were just trying to cash in on the popularity of Unicorn and didn't really have anything else relevant to say. There are things that could be explored in the Universal Century before F91, I think, pretty easily, but long and the short of it is that you're trying to cram in stuff into this very narrow gap that is supposed to have relevance to the greater story when the greater story is done already. Like, there are plenty of times to explore this kind of thing. There are plenty of places to go, but you have to give it the time to do it. And Gundam Narrative doesn't get the time it needs. Gundam Narrative is adequate. It is nothing to write home about. It's a real shame that all this fine animation got used to make a fundamentally dull as dishwater story. But that's how it goes sometimes. So ultimately, knowing all this and considering all this, Gundam Narrative is just another piece of Gundam media. There are lots of manga and side stories that could be adapted and, have been adapted, but instead they decided to make this a wholly original piece that ended up being a wholly unoriginal piece of crap. But hey, it's a pretty way to waste an hour and a half, right? And sometimes that's good enough for the pocketbooks.
Here comes the money.
Here we go. Money talk.
Here comes the money.